So, the first thing we have to do is understand what the Middle Ages mean, or the medieval. Um, Wonder if you've ever typed it into Google. If you type medieval times into Google, I bet some of you can guess what you're going to get. Ever been there? I was there once in Florida. My parents live in Myrtle Beach, and there's one right up the road. Bunch of people in modern plain dress come in, um, watch a bunch of actors ride around with armor and horses and hawks and stuff, and smash into each other with trick spears and eat, for some reason, entire birds and some undercooked corn. And I'm not sure what's going on in the back here. Actually, now that I look at this, I see that's superimposed, but you get the idea. If you have never been to one of these before, well, you're missing out on a treat. You get to go and be in the medieval times for a night. Or do you? What is this stuff? Where do these images come from? Knights and armor, whole strange birds of indeterminate, I guess they're chickens, who knows, jousting, hawking, kings and queens. What is this package of images and concepts? Where does this come from? Whose Middle Ages are these? Whose medieval times are these? For whom are these Middle Ages? Where did this packet, this imaginarium, come from, and why is it so select, and why is it always the same? Those are some questions I kind of want to think about in this course. In fact, ideas I want to sort of complicate or call into question, or even maybe try to um, uh, demystify, maybe even dispel a little bit. So what is this term, the Middle Ages? So I mentioned in an email or in my syllabus and my spiel and stuff that this course is going to try to do something like a negative image of the medieval times that most of us are sort of familiar with. And we're familiar with it from all over the place. It's all over culture, as I've sort of already mentioned. Tolkien has sort of installed the Middle Ages, or at least this packet of the Middle Ages, this package of images and concepts has sort of been installed in popular culture, not just in sort of scholarly culture or aesthetics. Um, so where does this come from? Well, I mentioned this sort of span of time from roughly 400 to 1400. Okay, let's start there. So why is this time bracketed off as something that happened, as something that mattered? Well, let's look at the limits at least. Um, 400, why 400? Well, in 410, so if we want to be really detailed or really careful, we would say 410, I guess. Rome was sacked by an army of Goths led by a Gothic king named Alaric. This is a painting from 1800s. But the unimaginable happened from the perspective of many people who were alive at the time, like in particular Augustine, who came to be Saint Augustine, for whom this destruction of the city of Rome was a disaster, a complete and inexplicable catastrophe. It seemed in their authors, in the remains, the writings of the time, it felt to people who were alive then like some sort of new, worse age had begun. Or at least those are some of the terms they talk about it, and it's not entirely true. But suffice it to say, 410 is on the records as being the year that a Gothic army sacked Rome. Um, that's 400-ish. There's lots of other things that were happening around then too, but this is the one that sort of makes that number significant for the determination of this period, this construct, the Middle Ages. So why 1400? The fall of another city. In a way, the same city, but not at all the same city. 1453, to be exact, was the year that a Turkish army um, sacked and kept and took Constantinople, which then was the capital of what was left of the Roman Empire. Well, what was left of part of the Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, to some Constantinople, and after this point slowly became known as Istanbul. So in 1453, this guy, a really interesting and smart leader of the Turks named Mehmed II, who came to be called Mehmed the Conqueror, um, led his army with just a gigantic cannon, which is still there somewhere in Turkey in a museum. It's called the Dardanelles cannon. Um, Pounded Constantinople into submission, and it has remained Turkish ever since. So this marks something what some people say to be the other end or the other limit. And in between these two dates, we talk about there being a time or a period. Well, so a period for whom? What was the name of this period? Who experienced this period? So far, I've only mentioned wars and sacks and destructions of cities. In fact, just two cities in the south of what is usually called Europe and the West, which are terms I'm going to talk about in a minute, and which we'll be exploring all semester, sort of in the negative. Um, I'm only, by the way, going to raise questions today, I think. We'll get some reading under our belt and talk about some other stuff next week. By the way, I just noticed this unfortunate guy who's captured mid-fall from this parapet here. So the fall of Rome, the fall of Constantinople, about 1,000 years in between. What do these dates have to? What do these have to do with each other? Um, I don't know, except that they're usually used as landmarks in the creation of a history, and that history usually has a name, and that name is the Middle Ages. This is a very, by the way, significant place. This where Constantinople is. This right across this Bosphorus, these straits, which have lots of names. There's the Dardanelles here. Um, there's Turkey on one side, and what was Greece on the other side for our the ancient period or whatever. Oh, I've got term. I'm sort of trailing into some old and um, remembered terms from my youth that I'd like to call into question. And anyway, this has been a very imperiled crossing for thousands of years here. It's famously the same sort of territory or the same sort of crossing of a body of water across which in 480 BC a Persian king named Xerxes strapped several miles of boats to make a bridge for his army to cross to invade Greece. Um, this same sort of embattled terrain has been under the sort of focusing eye of history since the beginning of that term. The Greek writer Herodotus coined the term history, Historia, or at least brought it into its current sort of meaning, or one of its current meanings, when he wrote in a century after this battle a book that's come to be known as the Histories of Herodotus, the first book of that name. What the word really means is investigation, and what Herodotus says in the first two sentences of that work is that what he's trying to investigate is why is the East always fighting against the West? But how he puts it is why is Greece always fighting with the barbarians? And explicitly what he meant was this event. Why are the barbarians from the East always fighting with we in the West? So let's go back a minute to these defining dates. These have been talked about in many ways over the centuries, but one of the more common ways until very recently was to speak of the fall of Rome in 410 as Rome falling to barbarians, the Goths being barbarians. Never mind that in the next century, the Goths will become the Roman emperors. This event was often spoken to as another sort of crowning disaster in the war with the West, represented by Constantinople, the Greeks of Constantinople, the Byzantines, and the barbarians, now represented by a different cast of characters, the Turks, which was, by the way, a multiracial and multi-ethnic and really international army. So there's a story that's been brewing for a very long time, not necessarily in the times in which these events transpired, but in some cases, as with Herodotus, already quite a long time ago. A story of we on this side of the Hellespont, of this crossing between what is Turkey and here, what is usually referred to as Europe. This side is Asia, this side is Europe. This is a very, very old idea, and trespasses across that boundary have been considered definitive of both sides and their interaction for over 2,000 years. So it's a very old, hard-cooked idea, this idea of East and West. And this battle, the fall of Constantinople, has been a crowning achievement then in sort of both a spatial and a chronological or a temporal um, uh, designation, I guess, or a series of designations. In other words, what defines periods from European perspectives like antiquity and the Middle Ages and the modern world is very closely related to what defines large senses of space, like East and West. So this is, oh, I was going to say something else here, which I will actually. It's interesting, I think, that determinations of East and West have sort of admit of no interspace, no boundary. It's a sharp line between these two realms, East and West. And we still talk about the world in these ways, despite the fact that the world is a globe with, radical, just basic geological and geographical problems with these terms, East, West. And yet we don't admit of a sort of a middle ground to that. And yet time admits of, has been allowed to have this sense of middleness. So stark black and white of space, sort of overlapping and being complicatedly layered over or under this idea of time, which has a middle. And then the question becomes, middle of what? Well, what was before it? What was after it? What's for whom is it a middle in any way? And at any rate, though these sort of designations of East and West as absolute boundaries, well, what I was going to say is Central Asia would, Central Asia would have words, but that's for a different lecture. The importance of this place in between more stark versions of East and West. But I wanted to think about this map a little bit before I let it go. This sort of cut right here between a sort of an imaginary east and a west. Notice it's interesting, it's almost more of a north-south. But let's take it as an east-west for a minute and look at some of the other things that seem to be drawn along that line. Close, but not quite, and yet still definitive. This is the more or less the designation of the Western and Eastern empires. Later in the Roman Empire, especially around the time of Constantine, who founded the city of Constantinople and moved his rule there, the empire sort of admitted it was too large, and so it divided itself up, and it had two Augustuses, and under them two Caesars, one set for the west, one set for the east, kind of like a president-vice president situation. And so there already is a sort of observed sense of west and east, breaking into the history of the Roman Empire. Another one is just the happenstance geographical spread of Islam in the 6th century, 7th and 8th century. The sort of furthest extent of that post-Muhammad immediate invasion or outward expansion, I should say, it doesn't quite fit neatly on that map either, but more or less observes it. The Byzantine Empire was too strong for it to sort of make any significant encroachment into what we call Turkey here. But nonetheless, this sense of East-West was further sort of underscored, at least from some perspectives, in the expansion of Islam. Notice, though, there's this interesting way in which by conquering large parts of Spain, of what is today Spain, Islam entered Europe. Properly speaking, it entered Europe, and yet for some reason, for hundreds of years, Eurocentric histories have sort of assumed almost as if Europe retreated out of Spain to make room for them, as if they pushed what is Europe back, and somehow the East was living in Spain for a while. And furthermore, not quite precisely along this border, but still nearly, is what became in the 11th century the final dramatic schism between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodoxy, which still obtains more or less along these boundaries even today. So there's lots of ways in which this sense of east and west from a European perspective is sort of over overdeveloped, highly articulated historically speaking, um, and yet it has these ancient roots and it has this sort of strange overlap with time. Um, where did this sense then of where did this name for this period of time, um, in which in European histories is given to this swath between 400 and 1400, where did it come from? And here I'm going to sort of anticipate readings that I'm going to offer for next week. Now, I never remember what slides I'm going to put on here. I was simply going to observe that more or less the same linear designation obtains. This was just a map that I got off of the internet um, when I looked up the West. Yeah, it's interesting what constitutes the West. Notice how much of what could be just as well called the much farther west, or even some kind of other east, is designated as the West. And here's, of course, Australia, which is in no way, shape, or form west of anything on this map, and yet there it is. Notice, though, that this all important sort of slice is still definitive. It runs right through what's modern day Turkey, and you might have, if you keep up on history, Turkey has sort of had um, problematic interactions with the United Nations and the European Union. Um, well, the European Union more than the United Nations about wanting to join the thing. Is it even Europe? The question begins, and then what in the world is Europe? So all of these colored patches here, you might say, have been sort of given um, or received, I should say, this concept of the Middle Ages that has something to do with those dates and something to do with the strifes and the differences and the geographical shifts that are sort of crafted and organized into what we are most of us taught as history. In the 80s, and my wife and I talk about this. We're both did our elementary school in the 80s and 90s, and we both came away from our history education, elementary and middle school history education, with a kind of curious story. And I wonder if you share it. The story goes something like this: first there was Egypt, then there was Greece, and then there was Rome, and then there was the Middle Ages, and then there was the Renaissance. Oh, and by the way, there were Chinese people somewhere. That was North Georgia people, but I mean that was my takeaway. Um, and of course, it's ridiculous in many ways. But one thing it does is sort of use Europe and use historical events most pertinent to Europe as a way of defining um, history, world history. Um, and this map sort of enshrines that elementary school thing that I got. So where does this term come from? Now, there's going to be sort of a moral to this story. I wonder if you can catch it. The Middle Ages. Well, we first start to see words that have anything like this meaning. That is a period, a term for a period designating that vague 400-ish to 1400-ish, or maybe specifically 1410 to 1453. We first see that a term arise for something like this period in 1469. These are all Latin terms, media tempestas, which means the middle time, the middle season. Funny enough, it can also mean something like the middle storm, but the middle time. Followed, and by the way, these could represent, there could be people that were in writing in Latin using these terms or terms like them all over the place. It's just these are the ones that we have that show these, that from these dates when we first see these specific terms. So there was no single term for this time. No single term that designates this concept that there was a time period that needs a name. Media Tempestas, 1469. 1518, you begin to see the use of this other term, this synonym, Mediaitas, middle time, middle age. 1519, we first find Media Antiquitas, the middle antiquity, the middle age, middle past. Media Tempora, middle, this is plural now, middle times, 1531. Medium Tempus, middle time again. Medium Aevum, or Medium Aevum, depending on how you're pronouncing your Latin, 1604. Intermedia Tempora in 1620. Medium Seculum, 1625. And there were a lot of other terms that seemed to be reaching to find a name for something, the same something. And the moral of the story, which I mentioned, is that you might notice that none of these terms come from that period in which are being named by the terms. Um, this comes close. Media Tempestas, 1469. So, what, 16 years after the fall of Constantinople, comes a term to designate what was going on before it. This was in a letter written to a cardinal, I think. Most of these come from very religious contexts, or at least I should say geopolitical um, correspondence between Catholic agents. I think most of these are. I'd have to go back and look, but maybe you don't care after all. So you might notice that none of these terms come from that period, and in fact, it's sort of a truism. We can't really ever define certify this, but as far as we know, there's no sense in which anyone living in these years in Europe or anywhere else conceived of themselves as living in the Middle Ages. No one ever thought they were in the Middle Ages. No one lived in the Middle Ages, if that makes sense. This term comes after the fact. After what fact? Well, these terms come to define something that has already passed, and which no one experienced as such. No one felt a sense of being in the middle of time. Well, maybe not. Maybe I should put a button on that comment, and we'll come back to it. Like, and was there a way in which people thought they were living in the middle of something? Well, anywho, suffice it to say, it is medium aevum of these terms that has won out, and it gives a Latin adjectival form soon after, medievalis. This is where we get the term medieval, which, funny enough, medieval was not a term used in English until 1817. But we do have much earlier the term Middle Ages, or Middle Age in English, more or less contemporary with some of those terms. It first entered English in 1570, and I think the quotes, I got these from the Oxford English Dictionary, you know, the big one, are interesting because they begin to sort of set a tone for what the Middle Ages was conceived to be. So this is in a book called Acts and Monuments by this guy Fox, the primitive time of the church, the Middle Age, and these are latter days of the church. So here already is some terms, any of you LDS, Mormons, the latter days. It's an interesting perspective on time to think one is living in something like the late time, the latter time, and that the middle time has passed. But as I said, no one ever conceived of themselves as living in the middle. Just like, by the way, no one ever conceived of themselves as living in early times. You know, no ancient Greek ever sat around and said, isn't it weird to be ancient Greeks? You know, they were the cutting edge of the modern, just like everybody. So no one in antiquity, by the way, knew they were in antiquity either. Of course not. But like East and West doesn't admit much of a borderland, you know, something like modern pre-modern would seem almost to make a kind of sense, at least analogous to East-West. But here's this thing called the Middle Age, which has its own fascination. Another interesting quote, 1605, we see this term again used. I got in Camden. I will only give you a taste of some of middle age, which was so overcast with dark clouds, or rather thick fogs of ignorance. Now here we cut to the heart of the matter. This idea that the Middle Ages is a dark age. I'll talk about that term next week, and you'll read about it too. A dark age, an age of ignorance, an age of fog and folly, better left behind. Now, of course, no one, well, maybe not no one, thought this about their times. But another thing about this is that the Middle Age collects a massive amount of space and a massive amount of time, 1,000 years. And generously, we could say all of Europe, although what constitutes those borders? Is Scandinavia Europe? Is Russia Europe, for instance? But anyway, no, let's just take two people living even in the same year, one, say, in northern England, maybe around in Northumberland or something, and another living in, let's say, Prague in the same year. I'll throw a dart on the timeline, let's say 900. They probably would not have any concept of sharing anything in common with each other. Nothing. And yet, looking back, we do these sort of injustices, and we say, well, they have one thing in common. They're both medieval. Now, you can bring that to greater absurdity. You could take somebody like Dante and somebody like random Viking. who 700 years earlier was cutting French heads off on the coast of Normandy or something. Why are those two people considered part of the same age or even part of the same place? So these large global temporal constructs, um, they arise. The idea of Europe as a thing and the idea of the Middle Ages as a thing, in a sense, arise together after the facts. There are, however, some interesting senses of middleness, more or less pertinent to the area, which crop up despite the fact that no one knew that they were in the Middle Ages. So here is a stone which contains in runes the Old Norse word Midgardr. Midgard. Actually, this must be an accusative form because it's just Midgard. Those are runes. Midgard, also known in its Old English form Midanjard, also known in its Tolkien form Middle Earth. So at least one sort of ideational map or concept of one's place in the universe contained in Europe in this time period contained a prominent sense of middleness, and that is what I'll vaguely call the Old Norse perspective. So you probably have some exposure to all this because of Thor and stuff like that. But you know, a map, a sort of map of the universe, arises in the oldest Old Norse literature, the Eddas, etc., which names and places the world as we know it in the midst of a vast cosmological construct. In this case, 9 worlds, all sort of loosely attached to a tree called Yggdrasil, a massive ash tree that sort of contains and holds together all of these different worlds. We occupy Midgard, or Midanjard, if you're Old English, the middle world, the world that's in the middle of lots of other vast powers and deep, unfathomable depths. So yeah, there's other times when these sort of senses of middleness come up, none really corresponding directly to the Middle Ages as I want to try to understand them in this class. For instance, there's the Mediterranean, the Mare Mediterraneum, which means the mare, the sea that is in the middle of the land, Mediterraneum. There's Mesopotamia, which is a Greek word for the lands and empires in between, Meso, the rivers, Potamos, Potamia, Mesopotamia, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, and the fertile area in between and its empires. Nonetheless, I don't know if that word shares any cognates in Babylonian or Akkadian or Sumerian, which would suggest a self-consciousness of being in the middle. There's one more, which I'll talk about down the road, though, that I think might be interesting when we have a little more reading under our belt. Zhongguo, which is the name in Chinese for China. Just as I say that, I don't know how old that term is for the place. But Zhong means, or Zhong means the center, the middle. Guo means the state, the empire. So it's the Middle Kingdom, as it's sometimes called. So we're talking for now about Europe. Let's take a look at some actual maps. So what I just showed was a sort of conceptual map. This, by the way, is not a drawing. There are no drawings. Well, there's like one from the 17th century, but there's really no drawings that we have in medieval Old Norse manuscripts of this. There's only the words that describe it and suggest that there's something like a conceptual cosmological map that in which we have a place in the middle, the yard in the middle, the Midgard. This is a map from the 12th century, 11th century by a guy named Al-Idrisi, an Arabic map maker, a world map. So these are sort of Exhibit B or Exhibit C or whatever I'm on. I want to just take a look at a few maps in which we can maybe try to situate something like a world view that at least includes a kind of middleness in the designation of time, of historic time, and of also geographic regions. So this is a world map. You might look at it for a minute and squint and and say, you know what, forget it, I have no idea what I'm looking at. Well, that's because, uh, well, that's because it's upside down, man. But of course it's not. But who says that north has to be up? In this case, north is more or less down. And what we have here is a very large crescent-shaped Africa with a little Arabian peninsula next to it, and an Israel kind of bending without much of a bend into what we call Turkey. And then here, I guess, is what we would call Greece, coming down to the Adriatic, and not so much a boot as a stub. There's Italy, Spain, etc. So this is more or less upside down. Europe features here. Africa has this strange, long hemispherical upness. And then what we would call Asia is over here. Center being, well, let's see, where would I place the center? Somewhere around here, which would make sense. I'm not sure, but I'm wondering if Baghdad isn't more or less, or even Mecca perhaps, is functioning as the center of this map. This map has a long pedigree, however, not just Arabic, nor does it even necessarily speak to something like a native Arabic, non-European view. This map very closely resembles something that's referred to as a TNO map. So what is a T&O map? Well, it's a way of envisioning the world not so much accurately, if that, which doesn't, not realistically, as symbolically. And it's a very, very old concept of how to organize the world that was known to the people who would make such a map. The TNO map, here's a primitive, I hate saying primitive, but maybe I should at least just say a very old map from our perspective. This is from about 600 BC, and it's a Babylonian version, a cuneiform tablet, which includes a map of the world, which has a line, a prominent line here, and a bit of a crossbar. This same basic sort of conceptual structure of the world shows up in lots of different later cultures, European and Arabic, not only. So here is a version of the map in which you can see in Latin the names of the regions more legible, and also the axis changed a little bit, but the T in O is the O of the sort of round world with a T drawn in it, showing how the world is divided into three basic components: Europa, Europe; Asia, Asia; and Africa. And then it says Terra in the middle, the world. Yeah, this map is all over the place. You'll find it in just hundreds of manuscripts. Here's another one in the same orientation: Asia, Europa, Africa. Now here's another more sizable version of the same basic idea with incredible detail. This is a monster of a document, of a work. It's an entire hide of a cow. It's quite large. If you had a medieval manuscript made out of parchment, would be this cut up into what we would, comparatively tiny little pieces, and eventually cut, folded, and stretched into pages. But this entire thing, the entire back of the usable portion of this animal, was used to make this very, very large map. This is called the Hereford map. It's around the 13th century. And you can see, still sort of operating after so many centuries, the T and O. The O with something like an outer Oceanus river, and drawn more or less in the waters of the Mediterranean and / Black Sea, this being something like the Black Sea and the Mediterranean being over here, is the cross of the T. Here's Africa, here's Italy, here's Europe, and here is Asia. So this is one sense in which the world is organized with a center or a middle. It just doesn't have necessarily any relationship to the Middle Ages. Although I wasn't quite sure where Al-Idrisi had planted his center, but European TO maps will, without fail, always choose a center, the same place as the center for its maps. Any guesses? Jerusalem, which I think is that little guy right there. Is this, did I have the Epstorf map? No, actually, this is the last map I had on here. Um, I'd like to kind of keep this conceptual structure of the world in mind. In a way, these maps aren't just graphing geographic space. And furthermore, for any sort of travel or navigation, these maps are quite useless. They're rendered with such detail because they're not trying to capture real geography. They're trying to project an idea of the world as an ordered arrangement. They're trying to present the world as creation with a pattern that can be seen. The fact that Jerusalem is the center of it is significant, not just arbitrary. The center in Jerusalem organizes the whole. So you might be pretty clear on the fact that Jerusalem occupies a space pretty deep into what I was looking at before as the East. If history, right, that is Herodotean history, is right in sort of dividing the world right along the line between Turkey and Bulgaria and Romania, that is the Europe and Asia. If it's divided along the line, Jerusalem occupied a space pretty deep in enemy territory. If given that history that uses these sorts of distinctions is usually on the European side. Hence, the Crusades, which, if any time before 1453, gave rise to a sense of a common European, a shared European project or a shared European essence. It was the Crusades against Islam, just to take back that center of the universe, um, Jerusalem. So I haven't haven't made as much sense as I might have liked. I didn't mean to come in here and answer any major questions. I just wanted to use this video to sort of bring to the table a lot of the problems and a lot of the terminology and issues that I'd like to sort of parse out and play with over the next couple weeks. Problems of periodization and problems of geography and problems of history that organizes itself according to these ideational geographies and these concepts of time. Because when we push when we push much against the Middle Ages, it very quickly crumbles. And in fact, any period that we try to designate for these uses will also very quickly crumble under any pressure. So we're going to put some pressure on it, and we're going to see what we can do with them. And then for the rest of the class, when we get into what I'll call the workshop portion, let's try to rebuild them, but in any way that we want. What I want to take away from this video is that, if nothing else, the idea of the Middle Ages is a fiction, in a sense. It's a fiction created after the fact by people who, if you took that one quote by the guy Camden at his word, created by people who weren't necessarily generous in the time period designated. Hostile, a hostile designation, in other words. And it's a period that therefore needs much rethinking and definitely not open acceptance, easy reception. It's a term that needs some critique, in other words. So I'll leave you with that, guys, and I'm going to go make another cup of coffee. I'll see you around.